When I was 9, my mother took my sister and I to the estate sale of her girlfriend's husband's grandfather. He lived in a little mansion on some grounds a little ways out of the city. My father was working that day, or I think he was anyway. Isn't it funny how we fill in the little details of these stories by deduction? It was a weekday, I remember that, around 10 o'clock in the morning, that magical time of day. But he could have just as well been golfing or flying to Canada. The worlds around our stories have to be constructed like a New York City street set on a Hollywood soundstage. Does it ever make you wonder about the stories themselves, even though those are the things that feel true? My mother worked nights, waiting tables. The mansion house was 5 stories tall and had an elevator for the live-in help. Nobody lived in anymore, not these days, said my mother's friend. It had taken them nearly 2 years to settle the estate. A lot of the furniture was covered by sheets, but a few of the rooms looked like they'd be ready to host a party or a meal at a moment's notice. For 5 years, when the house was first built, there was a functioning zoo on the property, said the friend. In the kitchen, she made coffee and gave my sister and myself each a piece of candy. Then my mom sent us outside. Come back in an hour. Don't get lost. Whenever I return to old neighborhoods of my childhood, I'm amused to find that which once represented the western and eastern horizons of my known world is little more than a few streets, a couple of blocks. Your house, a friend's, the school, the basketball court, and a corner store. A 15-minute walk end to end, a minute to drive it. The ice cream stand merely around the corner, not actually a grand adventure away. Children are so acutely in tune with every little detail of their condensed worlds. The location of every June bug-covered electric box, and in which week the bugs can be expected to arrive for the season. Every hole in the fence big enough to cut through, and every willow tree old enough and wide enough to hold secret meetings beneath. As we grow up, we learn to see patterns, to overlook things to save time. Well, if my neighborhood was the known world, then this was some foreign, unexplored country. We were escorted by a pair of bees, one furry and one fat. Down the slope, past the garden, and over the creek, a peach grove. Farther on still, past a shady, clovery meadow, an old stone bird bath, and a mossy wooden bench with a nice view of the neighbors' vineyards, we came to a little cemetery. And it was so quiet, except for the insects and the birds, that you could pretend the car was never invented. It was overgrown, though not terribly so, and there were no more than a dozen graves at most. Every now and again, there came a sound as if someone nearby was whistling a peculiar tune, though at the time there seemed to be nothing peculiar about it. In fact, it seemed the most natural thing in the world. At the far end of the cemetery, at the culmination of a tall hedgerow, there squatted a spindly gazebo. On the little table inside, a newspaper was fluttering around beneath a stained coffee mug. Farther down, for all the land seemed to be rolling down, away from the house in one big tumbling wave, and across a short field, there stood the remnants of an old stone house, just the exterior walls, 2 stories tall and long, like a small mill, though there was no wheel and no river to dip it in if there were. The window holes were evenly spaced, and there was an arch over the door hole, and besides what light could cut through them, the inside was overrun by a severe shadow, despite the lack of any roof, which seemed almost supernatural, so close to the sublime mid-morning light in the clearing all around it. It gave me a weird feeling, actually. It's one of the clearest feelings in my memory of the day. My sister seemed to not even notice it, let alone receive any sort of disturbance from it. She was already off on her knees in the tall grass with her sketch pad, making crayon rubbings of one of the older, smoother headstones. Shadows of clouds moved over the grass, as light as the bricks of the ruins were heavy, and their weight had a gravity which drew my eye over and over. Seemingly, I could not go 30 seconds without at least glancing in that direction, and I eventually realized I would get anxious whenever I wasn't looking at it. It wasn't only the mass of bricks, it was the darkness against the light. It seemed impossible that such a depth of dark should exist in the same plane of perception as the rest of that brilliant, banal day in late May. That some calculus of canopy foliage and geometry of architecture, lay of the land, should add up to the pocket of midnight in all that daylight. I felt suddenly almost quite cold. My sister was whistling and holding her sketchbook page up against the sun. The wind went through her hair, through the grass which was dancing up round the hem of her skirt, fluttered the page, fluttered the newspaper in the gazebo, which gave the distinct impression of some third presence among us. My sister picked up one of the wildflowers that were growing along the base of the wrought iron gate and asked me to put it in her hair. It seemed natural to me that our journey would continue on past the old house. That seemed to be the direction this country was shuffling us, and I did not know how to tell my sister that I did not want to pass that way. I did not want to go any closer than we already were. My chest and shoulders relaxed slightly when she began rubbing another headstone. I looked again. There seemed to be no place further for us to go. The general sweep of the land which had guided us to this point seemed to conclude at a dense copse of pine trees maybe 200 yards beyond the ruins. My sister held up the rubbing and asked me to read what it said. Meredith Granger, 1860 to 1947. How old was she? She asked. 87. Wow. I want to live to be at least 90, I said. My sister said that she would feel cheated by anything less than 100 years, then crawled over to the next headstone. It looked like something was moving in the old house, in the darkness of the ruins. I held my breath and listened, and thought I could hear, far, far away, the tide and ocean breathing. At the fringes of physical geography or imaginary, I couldn't tell which. Whenever I looked next, my sister was gone. Not even a trace of yellow wax to be found, only the sound of the wind. Forced to actually examine what was around me, I saw that the cemetery seemed to continue on the other side of the hedgerow to my right. I walked back around it and found my sister, seated at the base of a limestone sarcophagus, raised part of the way out of the earth. She had her hands cupped around her face. I expected to startle her at any moment, but she didn't seem aware of my presence even as I walked around the monument and came up beside her. The name was embossed in the stone. Sophia Granger, died 1909 at the age of 21. Sophia, I said, that's your name. Webby brown tendril vines were spreading across the stone, like the jealous earth was grasping her back, swaddling and swallowing. Do you ever worry that the oceans are too big? That there's too much water and it's just going to come crashing over everything one day and drown everyone forever? We're already 70% water, she said, and didn't uncup her hands. You don't even know what that means, I said. That's just something you heard Dad say. I can see her, said my sister. I looked closer and saw that there was a small window in the sarcophagus. My sister's face was pressed to it. What do you mean you can see her? I said. She's smiling at me, she said. What do you mean? I repeated. She didn't respond, didn't budge. I had a squirming feeling growing deep in my stomach. It was very quiet and I felt very alone. I turned my ear hoping to hear our mother calling to us. It did not seem possible that she could be within 50 miles of us. My sister screamed and started to cry. She sat with her back against the great slab and buried her head between her knees. I bent to look for myself. The glass was aged and foggy around the edges, most spots marred beyond luster. From what I could discern, a sequence of mirrors had been arranged, like a reverse periscope to direct light downward into the tomb. How? I asked. There was moss growing and much of the glass. I could see nothing but imperfection upon imperfection. But then I changed my angle and gasped. There was a glimmer of something solid, a space beyond the mirrors. I quickly honed in on it, a dress. I was cold all over, and hands, finger bones, delicately interlaced. How could you see her? I asked. I tried every angle imaginable and couldn't even conceive of any way to see beyond that relatively narrow slice of where torso used to be. She had her arms wrapped around her knees and was sniffling. She has a yellow ribbon in her hair, she said. What do you mean? I said. How do you know that? How can you even see her face at all? She just looked at me. Sophia, she's 89 years dead. Do you mean you saw her teeth like a skeleton's face? No, she said, the kind of smile you only do with your lips. She closed her eyes to demonstrate and turned up the corners of her mouth just so, as if she were peacefully sleeping. I bent again to the looking glass, and it was a long time before I could even find the dress again in all of the murk. But once I was in the coffin with her, my legs began to feel heavy, my lungs weak. I could feel my hot breath off the cool shade stone. Everything underground is the same cool temperature, or at least it is in caves. I learned that when we visited one in Kentucky for a class trip. I could hear Sophia picking dandelions behind me, but I couldn't pull away from the window. I really felt like if I tried to back up, my back would hit the bottom of the coffin lid. Then I heard my mother's voice, calling from very far away, sounding as if the words had left her mouth ages ago. Yet, I was still stuck. I thought if I looked away, her fingers would move and I would miss it. I'd never even know that I'd missed it. My sister said my name, and it felt as if she were nearly as far away as our mother. I felt her tug at my dress as if it were already a memory. How had she even seen her face anyway? She was running away, my sister, swishing through the grass, retracing our steps home. An airplane flew past somewhere. The wind rose silently up through my hair, then ruffled something near my head. A piece of paper atop a pedestal. One of Sophia's unfinished rubbings, held in place by the bare daffodil nub of her crayon. The inscription along the toe of the end of the sarcophagus read, "Our sunshine girl, to a daughter who never liked the dark and would never be caught without her yellow ribbon. Now the sun will smile on you until the end of time." A trail of more than a dozen red and black box elder bugs ventured up the flank of the tomb, leading back to somewhere in the shady brush around the head. I've always been fond of these fellows. They are the only bug I will tolerate. They are just big enough to have a personality. A fruit fly is nothing but a speck of dirt that can jump up and fly in your eye, and not so big as to invade our sense of proportion like a cockroach. I know many girls favor ladybugs, but the way their wings could just pop up and take flight at any moment always put me on edge. The box elder's legs splay out at such silly angles that he's forced to waddle like a dog in socks. His big, graceless feet look like 3 pairs of clown shoes. They move at our pace. They've none of the twitchy, flighty energy which is so repulsive and squeal-inducing in other bugs. Place your finger in front of one and watch him practically hitch up his pants as he accounts for this development and recalculates and adjusts course. Maybe it's just something in the peculiar tilt of their antenna which is so endearing, expressive like a horse's ears, when they stop whatever it is they're doing, usually walking somewhere, and gaze up at you. See his drooping from exhaustion at trying to climb over that ledge, a cartoon embodiment of their curiosity. I looked up and the airplane was gone. Only the contrail remained, quickly dissipating into all that blue. I blinked and it was gone. I thought I saw a turtle in the shady algae pond to my left, but it was only a shadow stretching over a rock. Many things in this country were such. The cicadas howling swelled to a fever pitch, then broke and receded. My mother's voice again, clearer, more insistent. It struck somewhere high up along my spine like a tuning fork. I stood a bit staggered, lightheaded as if I'd just woken from a long sleep. There was a peacock standing at the end of the hedgerow. I couldn't even guess how long he'd been watching me. I folded Sophia's sketch paper to put it in the pocket of my dress. She'd made an impression of a little symbol, a rune or sigil, so faint in the stone that I hadn't seen it, the punctuation mark to the epitaph. On my way back, I crossed a small footbridge, which I hadn't crossed on the way out. The landscape was vaguely familiar. I couldn't tell where I might have even gone astray. When my mother's voice came out again, it sounded further away than ever. I couldn't even be sure I hadn't only imagined it. There was a sense of urgency now. A small family of deer were watching me from the shade, and when her voice was gone, it seemed impossible that it had ever been there. The sun was directly overhead and growing warmer. I walked until I came to a clearing full of clover and dappled light, and squirrels running down tree branches above, chasing each other. The noise they made must have been laughter. The ground was littered with peaches and peach mush, and the air was peach fragrant and intoxicating. A sour waft of rotten beneath all this sweet, all of the life. The soil and the sky were impossibly rich, overflowing with an abundance of their own essence. I wanted to give my body over to it, lie against a tree, and simply melt into the great, endless, idle churn of existence. From there, the path continued into the woods, where the trees grew dense and wove together overhead. It was darker and narrower than any way I'd yet passed, but it seemed to lead in the direction from which my mother's voice had come. And I could see a light at the end of it, though the tunnel ended up being much longer than it looked from the outside. I didn't notice when the birds' sounds went away, only that they were gone. It seemed that most parts of the world I'd taken for granted were gone. All that was left was a heavy, musty smell that made it hard to breathe. The path led out at the top of a small, primitive amphitheater, nestled into a natural depression. When I tell you what I saw on the stage, you are going to want to call me crazy. Maybe you will, or say that I was too young, or misremembered. I wish you wouldn't, but it can't always be helped. Just tell me this. Who's crazier, the fool or the fool who stands there listening to them? You've come with me this far, haven't you? And never suspected a thing about my sanity, did you? In one glimpse of the stage, some 8 or 10 rows down, I saw a chestnut suckling calf of 2 heads, blinking and brand new, 2 mouths, 2 noses, testing the air. The stillness was near supernatural. 3 stubby little hornlets. Then, like a jump cut in a movie, perhaps my focus drifted for a half second. It was gone. A lone songbird called from nearby. It seemed suddenly very late in the day. There was a flash of lightning, brighter than the sun, and a second later a sharp peal of thunder in a clear blue sky. My sister was lying in the middle of the stage, unconscious. I shook her and yelled her name until her eyelids fluttered. The years had papier-mâchéd layer after layer of dead leaves and detritus into a sort of perpetually soggy carpet. She was slow to wake and confused, and a little ornery when she did. I could have sworn that there was somebody or something else there, watching the whole scene unfold, but I looked around and I saw nobody. In the car on the way home, I held my book in front of Sophia's face and pointed out one of the sentences. "What does that say?" She looked at the words, looked back at me, and shrugged. "What about that?" I asked her. "Nothing." I flipped through the pages, front to back to front, until I found it, the word, ribbon. I held the book up for her, pointing at it. "What does that say?" But she was already fast asleep.